rather sober interlude, the kind of light session we were supposed to have, seems completely inappropriate. So I will apologize in advance. What the organizers wanted me to talk about was the perils of being an educated politician. That's their topic, not mine. And talking about that, I felt the only way to do it was as informally and I hope humorously as possible, except that now, having just watched all of that, perhaps we need cheering up all the more. I did want to say, though, that the idea is not to inflict a long speech on you. I'll talk a little bit about my experiences in politics, but the more interesting thing, I think, would be to respond to your questions, see what's on your mind. So let's have an interaction afterwards in the time that remains, and we're supposed to wrap up at 6 when we actually were supposed to start at 5:30, but I'll go on till about 10 past so we can have a chance to use the time that was intended to be there between us. So what does the topic actually mean? I was wondering, the perils of being an educated politician. So there's clearly a perception that there are perils. And I suppose if one were to look at my experience over the last 10 and a half, almost 11 years now, in elected office, you can get a taste of some of those perils. I came into politics, I suppose, in rather unusual circumstances, in that unlike pretty much everybody else in the business, I hadn't spent a lifetime in politics. Almost every other Indian politician either hails from a political family, which I don't, or has very strong political antecedents, which I don't, or has been a student activist, risen up the ranks and worked in a political party all his or her political life, which also I don't. So I came in really, I think on a whim by the Congress party leadership that thought that I might have something to contribute, given the visibility and attention that my unsuccessful run for Secretary General of the UN had, not to mention, of course, that there were still some people, it was assumed, who read my books and thought that I might be a different sort of voice for what they were thinking about. In any case, I had no idea what I was getting into. I very cheerfully said I was happy to contest, and then went through quite an extraordinary reception. My own party members burned my effigy upon my getting the nomination because they were supporting the person who'd lost the 2 previous attempts. He felt he deserved a third turn. There were various sort of attempts to disown me. There was the point made, not unreasonably, who is this fellow to think he can represent us? He doesn't know our place. He's used to working in air-conditioned offices in 3-piece suits. Can he even speak our language properly? What's the point? How can we have this person there? Etc., etc. And it was a challenge from the very start to actually be considered a legitimately acceptable candidate, and that too in a seat that had been held on the 2 previous occasions by the Communist Party of India. So I thought I would refute all this in the only way possible, which is to do everything that was asked of me by the party, to do so attired simply in local attire, speaking perhaps a rather rudimentary Malayalam, but nonetheless one picked up on holidays to my ancestral homes in Kerala, which therefore was far from faultless, but was not inexistent. And just go out there in the hottest month of the year, and the hottest times of the day, talking to people and explaining to them that I hope to give them voice. And of course, the attacks on me about my inadequate Malayalam were actually the simplest to refute, because I simply said to them in Malayalam after listening and talking to people for a while, that as you can see, I have enough Malayalam to understand your needs and your aspirations. And what's more important in Delhi, I have the Hindi and English to give voice to them in Parliament. All our alternative colleagues who speak Shuddh Malayalam with you here are not going to be able to be half as effective as me in Delhi. That argument worked, and I ended up winning with a record majority for the first time. That's actually when the troubles got worse. I found that every single thing I said became an issue of controversy in our media. I think some of it quite deliberately motivated, malicious, but I was a babe in the woods, completely unprepared for this. On my visits from the UN or on my visits to India from my living abroad, but to talk about my books or my writing or the UN work, I'd always been treated to an excessively friendly, respectful, and deferential press. So I got an overdose of the opposite in my very first year in office. And literally anything I said, some of you may even remember the various controversies whipped up over anything, any expression I used. If I said that Saudi Arabia could be a useful interlocutor with us, that was immediately created into a controversy alleging that I had said Saudi Arabia should be an intermediary between us and Pakistan, which of course is not India's foreign policy and is not something that I'd said, but that became a controversy. The same thing happened to others. The most notorious one of the lot was when I was asked by a journalist, a BJP-leaning journalist on Twitter, when the government announced an austerity drive. He said, "Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class?" Now, I had been living in the States where cattle class is a very routine expression, been around for 30 years. It is nothing insulting to people. It's an expression that actually insults the airlines for herding us into economy class like cattle. And since he used the expression, I assumed everyone knew it. So I replied, "Yes, I'll travel in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows." Now, this may not be terribly funny, but I issued the tweet, got on a plane, went off on a visit to Liberia in Africa, and I had to go to Brussels, change aircraft there, fly to Accra, change aircraft there, fly to Liberia, and all of these intermediate points I didn't have access to any social media, anything. It's only when I got to Liberia, 23 hours after I left Delhi, that I was getting all these panicky calls from Delhi saying that the proverbial dung had hit the proverbial fan, and that there were calls for my resignation for having insulted economy class travelers. I was in a state of disbelief that such a thing could actually happen until I got reports that my own party spokespeople were denouncing me. And in these circumstances, obviously, I had no choice but to call the party leadership and say, "Are you serious? I mean, doesn't anyone understand what this is all about?" And it took finally, after 4 days of front-page controversy, the Prime Minister, no less, to say to journalists, baying for my blood, "For God's sake, it was only a joke." I mean, this went on for several months, and one thing after another. It was very clear that my Agni Pariksha in my first term in office was to discover how unwelcome intruders were into the closed circle of Indian politics. And many, many controversies later that I won't bore you with. I actually did step down as a minister, and that turned out in many ways to be a blessing, because I'd been an extremely active minister in the foreign ministry. I think in all fairness, I was traveling over 20 days, every month, in order for us to be able to show the Indian flag in countries where no minister had traveled before. I became the first foreign ministry person from any country to get to Haiti after the earthquake, because I happened to be on a tour to Latin America for the government. When the earthquake happened, we had soldiers there, so I volunteered to go, was able to pay respects to the dead, to commiserate the survivors. It was a great experience, but all that sort of thing was taking a severe toll back home, because not only was I being attacked just for being me, but in the meantime, the talk was rumbling in the constituency, what's the point of having an MP who's never here? So having resigned, I was able to devote myself to my constituency, and that's where perhaps both the good and the bad happened. The good is that I became, simply by doing it well and doing it conscientiously, a rather successful constituency MP. I was able to deliver results, a number of pending things that hadn't been accomplished before by my distinguished predecessors. But the bad thing, of course, and this is where the other peril of being an educated politician came, was that there was absolutely no intellectual satisfaction in the bulk of the things one is required to do. People don't understand, frankly, how hard MPs have to work. At least Kerala MPs, where the voters are knowledgeable, they know their rights, and they're very demanding. And what I found was that 95% of what people come and ask an MP to do for them are things that in any Western democracy, no MP or senator or congressman would do because they'd be considered unethical. People come to you saying, get my son a job, arrange a transfer for my daughter, my son is posted in Nagaland and Kashmir and so on, we want him in Kerala, etc., etc. Or we've taken this loan, we can't afford to pay it back, talk to the bank and get us either delayed terms or reduce the interest or cancel the interest. I mean, it's all these personal favors, one after the other. And MPs are judged by their ability to deliver these personal favors to people. Now, obviously, that's not what I thought I was getting into politics for. But I had realized that if I was going to be in this unfamiliar profession, I would have to play it by the rules that had been established by decades of predecessors. So I forgot all the ethical principles of the Western democracies, and I started trying to do all of these. Hit or miss affair. Sometimes my request would reach a bureaucrat or official who for some reason still thought well of me, and he would make an effort to fulfill my request so my constituent would get the job or the transfer or whatever. And sometimes, quite rightly, it would be ignored because after all, why should perhaps an undeserving or a less deserving candidate be picked merely because an influential MP has pushed their name? And these are amongst the dilemmas that I imagine the officials receiving my requests were faced with. Some decided one way, some decided the other. But this is the kind of stuff that needs to be done. I remember one case, somebody came with a totally fraudulent request and I simply said, no, I cannot do this. And when the person left the room, my staff turned on me in horror saying, no Kerala politician says no. You simply have to say yes to anything people ask. Do it with as much sincerity as you can muster, but you cannot say no. And the story that was told to me was of a Kerala chief minister whose constituent came to him demanding that he write a letter to President Bill Clinton saying that he must see the constituent. Now, if I had been in the recipient of such a request, I might have said, this is stupid, I'm not going to do it. Bill Clinton's going to think I'm an idiot for writing such a letter. But the chief minister of Kerala was a very famously populist politician. He knew that what Bill Clinton thought of him mattered far, far less than what his voter would think of him. So he wrote the letter. And I'm sure it never reached Bill Clinton, but he had consolidated the loyalty and the allegiance of that particular voter. So that was, and this particular politician was also notorious for, you could reach him at 2 a.m. to get somebody out of jail. You could chase him into his bedroom to hand him a petition. And that's the kind of standard of democracy that Kerala politicians have got their voters accustomed to. What were the other perils of an educated politician? I think they became even more apparent. I came back into government, as you all know, discovered that being a minister of state has considerable limitations. As I found myself tweeting one day, being an MOS is rather like standing in a cemetery. There are lots of people under you, but nobody's listening. And that essentially summed up my experience in ministerial office. I realized that there's very little you can do in situations where really all the authority is concentrated in the cabinet minister. In the case of the foreign ministry, it was different because, at least at the beginning, during my 1 year there, allocations of responsibility were pretty clear. And so I was the de facto minister for Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, the Hajj, passports and visas. All of that came under me, and the files stopped with me. Whereas I think after I left, even that ended, and the ministers of state still had to send that back up to the minister. And this again shows the limitations of our system. If you come in with a track record and experience in administration or diplomacy or whatever, and you think you can just transfer that seamlessly to a governmental environment where the rules are different, you've got another thing coming. But then, as I said, there were other lessons to be learned. We got into opposition in 2014. I survived my election only because of that constituency work that I told you I was able to do. For example, there had been a national highway bypass that was meant to be built between Trivandrum and the Tamil Nadu border, where the marker stones had been laid on people's land 40 years previously, but for one reason or the other, the project had not been able to be built. And these people were stuck because no one would buy their land, since people said, your government's going to take over the land any minute now. And they came to me saying, can you either get the damn project cancelled and get these stones removed, or can you get the road built? And I thought the latter was a better idea, so I hassled a number of my colleagues in the UPA government, got the road cleared, got it included in the government's budget, and then with that, when that was done, ensured that the first checks to buy the land where the stones had been put down actually changed hands before the 2014 election. Otherwise, I was quite sure that the victors would claim all credit for having unblocked this logjam of the preceding 40 years. But anyway, so I did that, and that's the kind of thing that helped me win the votes of people. In a very tough election year, I was able to survive with a massively reduced majority, come into Parliament. And then, of course, we were so depleted in numbers that the opportunity to speak in Parliament and challenge the government became very important. And there, too, you could see some of the conundrums that educated politicians faced. One was undoubtedly the fact that, that our system means that, and this is a system we've essentially copied from the British, and I do consider it a peculiar British perversion to elect a legislature in order to form an executive. To my mind, that completely betrays the entire principle of separation of powers, because, say, unlike in the US, here, once you form the government with a majority in the Parliament, or in the Lok Sabha at any rate, you essentially don't care anymore about whether what you are proposing makes sense, whether the laws you're writing are comprehensive and accurate, because whatever you propose, you have a brute majority that acts as a rubber stamp for you. And that I found immensely frustrating, because we would have these debates in which the opposition would make very sensible and commonsensical suggestions. It wasn't just a question of policy preferences. But I'll give you one minor example. There was a bill which may have affected some of you, which actually had been initiated in the UPA days, but hadn't been submitted to Parliament, which the BJP brought. It was a bill that said that every bank, every firm, company, firm, factory, whatever, above a certain number of employees, had to provide in writing to all their employees a statement of their rights as employees in that firm. And we all thought that was a good idea. There was no opposition to it. But I suggested that since so many people working, say, in factories in UP or Bihar or Orissa might actually not be terribly literate and not be able to understand the legal language, why not say that you should give it to them in writing and explain it orally? You can call all the factory workers on the floor and explain, we're giving you this paper, this is what your rights are, here you are. And while I was making the suggestion, I could see a majority of the BJP members nodding their heads in agreement, because it was clearly a common sense suggestion, wasn't violative or a disagreement of their policy. But sure enough, when the time came for the vote, needless to say, my amendment was shouted down on the grounds that the BJP had produced a bill, and that bill was going to go through whatever people said in Parliament. So that too becomes part of a frustration for the average thinking politician. The other problem is that, in fact, unlike, again, some Western democracies, we don't really write the laws. The laws are written by bureaucrats in the government. They're discussed in the cabinet and brought in. And except those bills which actually go through standing committees, where you can see a very detailed discussion by politicians on those committees of the provisions of the bill, the actual discussion on the floor of the House tends to have really no impact on the bill. And that's, again, terribly unfortunate. And finally, when it comes to things like the vote, thanks to the anti-defection law, no MP is able to vote his or her conscience. Let's say that a bill is brought for a vote. In our system, all parties seem to have the approach that once they decide how the vote should be, it's de facto a whip, with the result that there is no issue on which an MP is free to differ from the party line and not vote as the party would wish. Because if they were to do that, they attract, under the provisions of the Anti-Defection Act, not only expulsion from their party, but expulsion from Parliament itself. And after all the trouble and expense they've gone to get elected to Parliament, very, very few issues are going to prompt someone to stand up and risk losing his or her seat in order to take a position of principle on a stand that the party has viewed differently. That's another one of the perils of being an educated politician. I was going on a bit too long, but I wanted to give you a sense of the range of all of these things. We do tend to frown on innovation. So that, for example, when I started tweeting, that's something that the political class looked at quite askance. Actually, the story is a little more interesting. When I first started tweeting, I was unfortunately one of the very, very few public figures so doing. In fact, I still remember a little headline when I reached 10,000 followers. And a number of very senior politicians, I won't name them, but people you've all heard of, very prominent people, said to me, hey, how do you get 10,000 followers? You know, any politician would kill for 10,000, an audience of 10,000. Tell us what to do. And I was trying to explain Twitter and so on to them. But meanwhile, in those days, the media saw Twitter as a threat. They thought, why should we allow politicians to bypass us and go straight to the public? We need to bring this down. And so, as I said, every one of my tweets was attacked. And after the first 2 or 3 controversies, I think particularly after cattle class, at that point, all these people who had asked me for help on Twitter kept far, far away. And there was this widespread perception that even something called Twitter couldn't possibly be the right thing for a serious politician to do. When I tried to explain that, you know, even Google and Yahoo are fairly silly words when you think about it, but no politician would think of doing without them. So why not Twitter? Because it's a way of reaching the public. There was stunned incomprehension. I gave an interview, which you can Google because it's on the record, in late 2009 to Harinder Baweja of Tehelka, saying that I was convinced that within 10 years, every major politician in India would be on Twitter. And as you all know, I didn't need to wait 10 years. Just 5 years later, Narendra Modi, as Prime Minister, was instructing every one of his cabinet to open a Twitter account. Because you need to multiply your voice to the public, bypassing established channels. The media realized the wisdom of this early enough, and they too piled on, because for them too it became a way of amplifying their reach, promoting their stories, and indeed getting shall we say, their share of what the politicians are doing. I remember the late Arun Jaitley telling me that he no longer felt he had any need to call a press conference, because if he wrote a blog, which he became rather famous or notorious for doing, both in opposition and in government, if he wrote a blog, it would be picked up by every media organization, and his staff didn't have to make 75 phone calls to convene a conference. Everyone would see it anyway. And that then became an approach of mutual interest to both the media and the politicians. The other thing, finally, that we all suffer from in our political establishment is a complete lack of sense of humor. I'm not sure that I'm sure that in private, these are the same people who are cracking dirty jokes and so on, or exchanging wicked humor on WhatsApp messages to each other. But somehow there is a solemnity to public discourse, which is quite unworthy of Mahatma Gandhi, who was, as you know, famously and impishly mischievous in his comments. You remember when he was asked by a British journalist, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And he replied, I think it would be a very good idea. Or when he was upbraided for striding up the steps of Buckingham Palace in his dhoti, in his loincloth, to go and meet the King Emperor, he smilingly replied, oh, I think His Majesty had on enough clothes for the two of us. I mean, that kind of thing. Have you heard of an Indian politician saying things like that anymore? It just doesn't happen. I scoured the works of Nehru for my biography on him, and it's his birthday today. A wonderful man, the greatest intellect to have ever been Prime Minister of India, and possibly one of the top 5 best political writers in the English language in the modern era. But if you look at his works, his speeches, his writings for humor, there's very, very little of it. I remember the one comment that I think was really sharp and witty was when he said in America, sort of with undisguised culture shock in 1949, he said, one must never visit America for the first time, which I thought was rather clever. But in private, I'm told he was a very amusing dinner companion, charming, entertaining, would mimic people, was just a lot of fun, got along with all sorts of people. But in public, we have this expectation that our politicians must be deadly serious. And I'm afraid that's a test I fail too often. So it's time to now turn to what's on your mind. Just to say that I tried to give you a little bit of a taste of the different things that might constitute the perils of an educated politician. But one that I'm very happy to run the risk of is you're asking questions that I might find difficult to answer. The floor is yours. Thank you. Yes, young lady. There's a hand up there in the middle of the room.
Two questions.
Okay.
And hopefully the first one is difficult. What's your favorite role, author or politician?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
What's your favorite role, author or politician?
I'm having real problems. What?
Can you hear me? Your role as an author or politician?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's much clearer. Thank you. Sorry. For some reason, I just couldn't hear you the first time. Look, I mean, I'm a human being who has a number of reactions to the world I see around me, some of which I manifest through my writing, my comments, my columns, and so on, and some of which I manifest through my work, whether it was at the United Nations, where I worked for refugees, I worked in resolving a number of international problems, I was in charge of the peacekeeping mess we had during the Yugoslav Civil War. So I've always felt it important to work in both the world of conclusions and the world of decisions, the world of reflection and the world of action, the world of thoughts and observations and the world of policy and engagement. I just found it impossible to give one up for the other.
So one last comment is, I'm a lawyer, and I heard your comment that, laws in this country are made by bureaucrats without lawyers' help.
Except those that go through standing committees.
Yeah.
And provided the standing committee's advice is
And
actually
they
taken
may
into
listen
account,
or not.
which it may
So
not be. Yeah.
Don't you think we need to change that?
Of course we do. I mean, I honestly think that our system itself, some of you may know that for over 25 years I've been writing passionately about why the parliamentary system was completely the wrong choice for our country, and it just doesn't reflect the way in which Indians vote, Indians behave. We actually vote for individuals, not for party programs. Our parties themselves are really identikit combinations of people with no real great coherent differences. I mean, the British invented this system to reflect their reality in a tiny island state where even today, after so many decades of population growth, a parliamentary constituency is 1 lakh people. It's just not where you can actually interrelate with, you can truly represent them. And even then, their system gives the parliamentarian complete freedom. The famous principles enunciated by Edmund Burke in his speech to the electors of Bristol, that once you elect me, I'm not obliged to you or to the party, I'm only obliged to use my best judgment to take the stands that I believe are right for you. And if you don't agree with me, vote me out. That is the principle. We don't follow that either. So we are now stuck in a position where we have the worst of all possible worlds, in my view. I have a lot of respect for the US system. And my American friends say, you're crazy because our system is stuck in gridlock. And I said, that's because you guys only have 2 parties. We'll never have gridlock with one president occupying, the White House there, Lok Kalyan Marg here, from one party and the parliament dominated by another party, because in fact, in practice, people have put 303 BJP MPs in largely because they wanted Narendra Modi. If they could vote for Narendra Modi separately and then vote for their local MPs, they'd actually vote for somebody whom they knew and understood and could relate to and could actually represent their interests properly. And that would represent, even today, over 40 different parties in parliament. So the person elected as the chief executive of the country, call him president, would have to create issue-based coalitions. And these people would be elected to legislate, not to form the executive. Right now, no lawmaker is actually interested in making laws. They seek election in the hope of becoming members of the government. That, I think, is a very, very flawed system. Sir.
Mr. Tharoor, your talk was delightful as usual.
Thank you, sir.
We live in a post-truth world. What is the role of an educated politician in a post-truth world? Or is there a role at all?
I don't buy this post-truth business. Honestly, post-truth is a very sort of postmodernist way of saying lies. Right? I mean, post-truth means essentially that it's untruth. And once you go beyond truth, the only field left is that of dishonesty and lying, mendacity. And that's not something that I think we should encourage or whatever. So, to my mind, if somebody says nonsense or spins completely fake stories or puts out messages which, as we all know, even in our own politics we've seen too much of, which can politely be called as fake news, we should call it out. We should condemn it. We should say this is wrong. I mean, if we start, understanding or believing that there is a certain reality which is what ordinary people experience and a different reality which is what governments and politicians project, then we are in for the high jump as a society and as a nation. I think we should reject all notions of post-truth. We should stand up with integrity, with conviction, with education, with knowledge, with principles and values and say, this is what we're here for. And this is what we're trying to stand up and do for the country. And if you don't like it, vote for someone else. But at least you know what you're doing, what you're voting for. Instead, we have all of this reliance on the submissiveness of the media and the forgetfulness of the public. So, Mr. Modi will stand up and say, give me 50 days, otherwise burn me alive. And no one's going to burn him alive. And that was when he made demonetization. Front page headline. When it had failed comprehensively after 50 days, when the Reserve Bank of India had become known as the Reverse Bank of India for the number of notifications it issued, changing the previous notifications. When all that happened, did anybody, even in the media, stand up and say, sorry, Mr. Modi, 50 days are up, here's the power? No, because the fact is that you can say anything and get away with it in an atmosphere where you're not challenged very specifically and strongly. And that is something that, it seems to me, we really do have to worry about. So the only answer to post-truth is the truth itself. The only answer to unprincipled dishonesty is principles and integrity.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Good evening, Indian politics is largely, commanded